I'm Theodora Scarrato, Executive Director with Environmental Health Trust, and I am just so thankful that the Montgomery County Safe G Group invited me to speak about the new zoning that has been proposed for Montgomery County, where I live and am part of the coalition working on safer neighborhoods, healthy neighborhoods, working on having people having more decision-making power when it comes to 5G and small cells being placed in front of our homes, which most people really do not want once they learn about the issue. So I wanted to talk about what's happening in Montgomery County about 5G and small cells, which in my opinion, is a land grab by telecom, one of the biggest land grabs ever that's happening right now, all in the name of 5G. And I'll talk about what's happening with the new ZTA that's been proposed, ZTA 1907, where the County Council Fed Committee just finalized, and we don't have everything written up, at least I haven't seen a write-up yet to look at it. But in the Fed committee, they made proposed changes to a new zoning text amendment, which would allow cell antenna, what they call small cells, even though there's nothing small about them, as I'll talk about, and basically shorter cell towers with not as many antennas on them, to be in front of our homes, 30 feet from homes with no routine notice, like getting a letter in the mail, and no hearings. Now, these would be in front yards. We're talking about hundreds of street lights and utility poles, which can be replaced with these short cell towers. So the way this happened is rather shocking.
So the first is the setback. So under the ZTA, the replacement pole has to be at least 60 feet from any building that's intended for human occupation. And this excludes the setback encroachments that are allowed as the limited use. So currently, if these numbers help, so there's about 9,000 poles that have less than a 30-foot setback, about 18,000 poles that have a setback between 30 and 45 feet, and then 14,000 poles that have a setback between 45 and 60 feet, and then 33,000 poles with a setback of 60 feet or more. And those reasons, those numbers are in there so you can see, based on what you decide that setback should be, how many more poles Montgomery County is going to get. So based on those numbers, the council staff recommendation is to limit that use distance to 30 feet. Currently it's at 60 feet, which is that about 13,000 poles that currently, the 33,000 that have that setback.
So our goal should be to allow a smooth, efficient process for antennas to be put on poles so that the companies can actually build the networks that we need. And the question is, how far from a building, can a pole be before a more intensive process is required?
The people of Montgomery County have worked for years to stop something like this, and I was quite shocked.
You see the ads. 5G wireless technology is coming to cities across the country, but now in Montgomery County, they're considering changing rules so 5G cell towers can be closer to homes. Fox 9's Lindsay Watts here to break it down.
Well, like it or not, 5G is eventually going to be headed your way. What's great, it'll give you lightning fast mobile internet, up to 100 times as fast as what we have now. You'll see it on your phone, but also in your neighborhood. The 4G towers that we currently have are big, at least 100 feet high. The 5G towers are smaller, but they need to be closer, positioned on street and light poles. This proposal in Montgomery County would allow them to be as close as 30 feet away from your home.
It's controversial. Efforts to do the same thing last year did not work out.
It's just a really challenging issue. It's a complex issue, and maybe people don't feel the urgency.
Montgomery County Councilman Hans Remer introduced the bill that would change current zoning that says cell phone towers have to be at least 300 feet from homes. His plan would allow 5G antennas 60 feet away from homes and potentially even 30 feet under certain conditions. There was so much backlash when he proposed this last year. Reamer had to withdraw the measure when he saw he didn't have the votes.
There's a lot of concern about how it's going to look, what the aesthetics are in the neighborhood. There are also objections. You know, many people believe that our phones are dangerous, right? They believe that these things give you cancer. I think most of us have made a decision in our daily lives that we're going to continue to use phones, and we're going to continue to rely upon wireless.
Reamer introduced the bill this week, and a public hearing will be scheduled soon.
We need to allow antennas, not unlike Wi-Fi routers, on utility poles. And that's a challenge because, you know, it adds some equipment to telephone poles, requires the installation of equipment on telephone poles or light poles. You may have to replace light poles with taller light poles or telephone poles with taller telephone poles. Or if you don't have telephone poles, you may have to install some kind of, you know, fixture, and that creates some anxiety and some questions. You know, I admire the Arlington County, you know, approach, which is, hey, if there's an existing utility pole or street light, you know, go for it.
It exemplifies what is happening around the United States and around the world, where companies are working at every level, supporting state law, federal law, and local ordinances that strip away people's rights to decide what's in front of them on the streets where they live, work, and play. So regarding the ZTA, I wanted to let you know that there is a letter writing campaign, which is also acting as a petition because it counts for people who live in Montgomery County or have their loved ones in Montgomery County. Please go, it's down here, actionnetwork.org, where you can, and I have a link in the chat as well, where you can write a letter and be counted. And also the coalition can update you with anything going on in the campaign. Each CHI is a scientific nonprofit. We publish research, we educate policymakers, and develop educational programs to raise public awareness. There are many experts who are part of this incredible team. We have several scientific conferences which are up online at ehtrust.org. So going back to the newly proposed zoning for Montgomery County, and this is a photo simulation that's on the Montgomery County webpage on cell towers, where they have a street light that now has an antenna on the top and a electric box. And to be honest, it's a rather pretty example of what small 5G small cells look like, because in reality, they're not so unobtrusive. So the ZTA that has been revised by the Fed committee at the work session allows cell towers to be on existing or replacement poles as long as they're more than 30 feet from homes in residential neighborhoods. And that's a change from the original ZTA, which was at 60 feet. It would require no notice to nearby property owners and no public hearings.
But now we're saying, if you want to come in and replace a street light, the street light only has to be 30 feet back to get the limited use. So we're reducing, whereas now we have a 60-foot requirement to use existing structures, we're going to make it so that if you come in and you replace a pole or a street light, you can have it as close as 30 feet.
We're talking about replacing our streetlights with these 5G cell towers, and your utility poles. You can either get antennas popped on the top or replacement poles, which have antennas on them. They're wider, they're taller, and there's also these equipment cabinets as well. I really want to add also that if they ask for a special permit that would allow poles to be closer, as I understand it, there is no limit in place for that.
Well, I don't think in any circumstances that we needed, I don't think we've ever in those 5 years discussed allowing things closer than 30 feet under any circumstances or any conditional use process. And looking at the maps that we had, I mean, given the number of poles and things that are out there, I don't necessarily know why we need to consider that.
Consider what?
Why we need to create a conditional use process that allows us to use poles closer than 30 feet in residential areas.
Because there are places where that will be necessary in order to have networks. I mean, I think the committee's already voted on that. So, you know, we have that established.
It would allow under a new waiver and objection process that the committee did not fully outline, new poles in brand new locations where no pole now exists to be built and used for small cell towers. But they would have to notify the property owners of homes up to 300 feet away from the site about the application. But there would not be any public hearing required unless someone who lived within 300 feet objected. And right now we have a situation where there is a tower committee which is effectively just rubber stamping these applications. I want to thank MC4T, the Montgomery County Coalition for the Control of Cell Towers, for the incredible research that they've done on this matter. They found that many already erected small cell, quote unquote, small cell towers don't even follow what the permit says they should be following. So we don't even have enforcement of the laws that we have right now. We have a broken process for review with the tower committee that needs to be addressed, and oversight and enforcement related to the infrastructure that we have now. So I have a list here of examples of small cells that are not following their permits. So on Travilla Road in North Potomac, there is a site 37 feet from a home. If you look at the picture here, this is one of 3 installed in North Potomac without first completing the required conditional use hearings. This is all according to MC4T. And I did ask Rick of the coalition if he could present. He is going to get me a date, but I wanted him to present all of the research that he's done on how these poles have been put up where they don't belong and where the permit says they should not be. So as you can see from the list, there are poles that are installed at the wrong location, that exceeded approval height, installed without a hearing. Here is the 68-foot wireless facility with antennas on Brickyard Road that was never formally approved to be in that location. And I'm sure many of you on the call have been in the public hearings in Montgomery County, where the family who lives in that house has repeatedly testified, calling to fix the broken process and also for help to get this installation moved and get the equipment taken down and moved because it was not permitted for this location.
I believe the council should make no changes to residential cell tower zoning rule until you fully fix the processing for reviewing and approval cell poles. Those processes utterly failed my family 8 years ago when the county allowed Pepco to remove a 30-foot pole directly outside my front door and replaced it with a 68-foot cell pole that is just 42 feet from our bedrooms. We received no advance notice. We had no opportunity to offer any input. I only found out last year that cell pole is in the wrong place. The Tower Committee actually recommended on May 5th, 2010, that cell phone antenna to be installed on a specific pole that is across the street and 150 feet away from my house. My message to the residents of Montgomery County is look no further than my front yard to see what is going on to your neighborhood. Because what I see every day is that, first, the Tower Committee only recommend but has no responsibility for final decisions on placement of cell poles. Second, DPS has no accountability for accuracy of permits nor conformance with Tower Committee recommendations. Third, and most importantly, when mistakes are made, the county council had no desire nor the authority to fix or enforce anything. Council members fix the current process and vote no on ZTA 1907.
Well, the Department of Permitting Services last year in testimony before this council admitted that they have done no coordination for 20 years with the Tower Committee. They have done no coordination to ever check what the Tower Committee was recommending. And at the icing on the cake, we heard the head of DPS last year tell us that there has been a grand total of one enforcement action in 20 years, even though we've documented dozens of non-compliant poles.
Small cell antennas like this one along Dufeath Mill Road in North Potomac may soon sprout up across Montgomery County. It's all due to telephone providers wanting denser coverage for their growing customer base.
Most of the towers that are being proposed are very obtrusive, very ugly.
Rick Meyer, a member of the Coalition for the Control of Cell Towers, isn't a fan.
What we're concerned about is that it's kind of a gold rush, that folks aren't paying attention to the rules, they aren't paying attention to the character of neighborhoods, to safety. They're just putting this technology out there as fast as they can.
Montgomery County officials acknowledge there are pros and cons. Among the positives, enhanced connectivity. County Executive Ike Leggett has requested more research be done on effects of radio frequency emissions.
I've talked to many people in different communities around the world. We work internationally and also nationally at Environmental Health Trust. And this is a situation that really is endemic because the companies are rapidly putting up this infrastructure, and there's a lot of mistakes that have been made in doing so. Here's a 57-foot cell pole installed in 2017 that sits 27 feet away from a 4-story apartment building in Langley Park. It's one of 3 large cell poles with a 900-foot radius placed very near apartments. This was installed along Norbeck Road, and it was supposed to be on the opposite side of the street within the utility distribution lines, but it was moved, and it's one of 3 cell poles in Norbeck area that were never formally approved for their current sites, and yet there they are. Now, in the United States, there are many cities that have passed resolutions, and I'm going to talk about resolutions and ordinances just to expand out as to what's going on, calling to, for example, halt 5G, Keene, New Hampshire, Hawaii County, Hawaii, Easton, Connecticut, Farragut City, Tennessee. There have been a variety of resolutions on 5G, including addressing health and environmental effects in many other communities. I have a list here: Hallandale Beach, Florida, Coconut Creek, Florida, Carmel City, Indiana. And there are also resolutions calling for changes to federal law where the elected officials are listening to the people who live in their communities and calling on the federal government to answer questions or make changes or do environmental assessments.
But so Matt bringing this up on 5G, definitely, we should definitely not allow that on our island or in our state until studies can be made. I agree with that totally, wholeheartedly. And with that said, I would also like to start investigating. Maybe that's what you could have put in there, investigating what already exists. And is our PUC
I hope that all of you are hearing about this as often as I am, and I'm not the only one in my district. But I know there's a lot of our constituents that have concerns about the 5G poles that are going up. Several different types of concerns. You know, there are health concerns as well as aesthetic concerns, and you know, we just got off a conversation about aesthetics and how important that is in our city. And you know, a lot of what I'm seeing are poles that look out of place, poles that are in people's front yards, at parks, and in public places that really don't match the surrounding areas. So just wanted us to have a chance to discuss that. Also discuss what kind of powers we have as a governing body. you know, with what the Florida legislature has passed, how we can, you know, what kind of control we do have. So.
To just hear what can be done about addressing the concerns of citizens about where poles are placed, because I do think that that can impact property values and the enjoyment of a person's property. So what can we do to address that? Also, I think that council should adopt a resolution that I would like to bring forward eventually, asking Congress to have an independent review of the possible health implications of exposure to 5G. So that would just be a resolution that we would send to our congressional representatives and our state senators.
But yet in Montgomery County, Maryland, one of the largest counties, highly populated, where people have been so vocal, we are looking at yet for another year, a proposed ordinance that is just shocking. I'm frankly shocked.
Okay, so I just want,
Mitzi, let me pause. We have, I believe, and I'm going to ask Lou to confirm, we have already agreed that whether it is an attachment to an existing pole or a replacement pole, it's 30 feet limited use.
That is correct in terms of what you just voted on.
So also in other cities, especially in California, they're passing ordinances to control, restrict, with various setbacks, with various rules that really trying to keep the infrastructure out as much as possible, unless necessary, so as not to violate federal law. And I have a list of cities there. We also have on our website a list of these cities. We link to the ordinances at ehtrust.org. Los Altos, California, as an example, and as a complete contrast to Montgomery County, has an ordinance where the installation of small cells on public utility easements in residential neighborhoods is prohibited. They have a 500-foot setback for small cells for multifamily residences in commercial districts, a 500 feet separation from schools, and a 1,500 feet separation between nodes. In Montgomery County, as far as I saw, sorry about that, there is no protections for schools, no protections for homes, no protections for schools, and actually a lot of communities address schools. And just as an example of some of the setbacks related to cell towers and small, quote unquote, small cells, I do have a picture of what I would call more of a cell tower in this picture. I wanted to just give some examples. So Calabasas has a 1,000 feet, Petaluma 500 feet, San Ramon 300 feet, San Diego, California has 300 feet for schools. There are many communities that have cell tower setbacks at 1,000 feet or over 1,500 feet. In Los Angeles, the firefighters worked very hard to stop the deployment of new antennas on their fire stations. And we have a webpage on Environmental Health Trust where you can watch them testifying, talking about the radiation. There was a study done many years ago that documented neurological impacts to firefighters when cell towers were put on their stations.
5G can be a tremendous boom to California, but only if it can be put up quickly and easily.
Hayward Assemblymember Bill Quark co-authored legislation that would make it even harder for cities like Piedmont to object to a tower.
You wouldn't have to go through the Planning Commission, through the City Council.
The former NASA scientist says he may resurrect the bill recently vetoed by the governor.
I know scientifically that putting up these cell phone towers is safe.
But the International Association of Firefighters disagrees. They began opposing cell towers on fire stations after firefighters complained of health problems.
These firefighters developed symptoms.
Dr. Gunnar Heuser conducted a pilot study on firefighters at a station with cell towers.
And the symptoms included problem with memory, problem with intermittent confusion, problem with weakness.
Heuser says their brain scans suggest even low-level RF can cause cell damage, and he worries about more vulnerable groups like kids.
So we found abnormal brain function in all of the firefighters we examined.
So, following lobbying by firefighters, Quark and his co-author exempted fire stations from their bill, making them one place cell companies couldn't put a tower.
This is the first piece of legislation that I think anyone's aware of where somebody got an exemption because they were concerned about health. Did they tell you at all about the study?
All I know is that when the firefighters ask, I do what they ask me to do.
Because they're strong lobbyists?
Yes.
So if, say, school teachers and parents had a strong lobby and they asked you to pass something that would prevent these from going up in your schools, would you do that?
If I couldn't get the votes any other way.
Firefighter and cancer survivor Tony Stefani notes,
it's not only firefighters, it's the people that live in the general vicinity of these towers.
Current regulations don't take into account continuous low-level exposure from these small cells 24 hours a day.
More of these studies have to be done.
There are 230 scientists from 41 countries who have apparently reviewed more than 2,000 peer-reviewed studies, and they're calling on the World Health Organization to do more studies. They're not convinced that this is safe.
I think doing more studies is always a good thing.
Do you think that maybe you should consider putting a pause on legislation that speeds up these towers until there's definitive evidence that there is no harm?
We can do a lot of studies, and there are people right now, believe it or not, who are sure the world is flat.
Smoke clean with New Bel Air. Air clean tobacco.
And they've been very active in California. In fact, I'm going to play for you a ad that they had put, a 30-second advertisement that they put out at the time.
Firefighters living and working beneath cell towers like this one have gotten sick. Headaches, extreme fatigue, memory loss, and brain scans show that firefighters exposed to toxic RF radiation experience cell death, ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has approved cell tower installations on fire stations in neighborhoods like yours. Call the board.
7's on your side in health matters, and many cell phone towers starting to creep into our neighborhoods, but some are asking tonight if they're a health threat. 7 on your side, I-Team investigator Scott Taylor breaking down who's on which side of this issue.
Have you noticed these small cell phone towers on street poles in your neighborhood? More could be popping up across Maryland as supporters believe the mini towers will streamline 5G wireless across the state. Opponents of these towers tell the I-Team lawmakers are not taking a close enough look at the potential health risk.
There are absolutely no long-term safety studies that have been done at all that prove any of this 4G, 5G technology is safe for long-term exposure.
Earlier this year, Maryland Senator Thomas Middleton introduced a small cell phone tower bill very similar to the one that was defeated in California last year after AARP, the Sierra Club, and the International Association of Firefighters opposed it. The I-Team did some digging. In the past, Senator Middleton accepted campaign donations from Verizon, Good Government Club, Comcast, and eBay. The senator emailed. He met with wireless companies and the Maryland Municipal League, and nobody mentioned health concerns. The senator's bill wants to preempt local zoning ordinances and cap tower rental spaces charged by cities to wireless companies. CTIA, which represents the wireless industry, says it supports 2 Maryland bills it claims will revolutionize consumers' wireless experience, and that the FCC and the FDA say there is no known health risk. The Ramazzini Institute in Italy just released a study it says shows lab animals exposed to environmental levels of cell tower radiation can develop cancer. The Institute study used exposures below the FCC limits, and its results mimic a $25 million study of much higher levels of cell phone radio frequency radiation from the U.S. National Toxicology Program.
We have had in the past a lot of wrong attitude, ignoring or discounting or discrediting good results. It is no more the time to do that.
The FDA says it has yet to review the Institute's study, but believes the current safety limits for cell phones are acceptable for protecting the public health.
After the I-Team talked to Senator Middleton, the Maryland senator sat down with local groups to talk about possible health concerns dealing with mini towers just like that one. Then his office told us the senator pulled the bill off the table and is reworking it. Scott Taylor, ABC 7 News.
Sorry, can I?
No. I mean, Mitzi, so far you have just expressed opposition to what we have said.
No, I just wanted to clarify on the current law that Councilmember Jawando had asked about and about what we prohibit now for conditional use. The conditional use is what is required in residential zones. There was no limited use. You had to go through the conditional use process.
Presently.
And the code right now states.
Okay, wait. You're just going to confuse us with talking. Unless someone specifically, if Councilmember Jawando wants to say this question, but please.
Yeah, I mean, she can finish what the code. I'd like to hear the end of the sentence, and then we can move on. Go ahead.
Okay. So what it states is that in the residential detached zones, the conditional use is allowed if it is a distance of 1 foot for every foot of height or 300 feet from an existing dwelling, whichever provides the greater setback. So effectively, in order to get a conditional use now, you have to be at least 300 feet back in a residential area.
Got it. And this changes this completely. So I get that. That's not relevant to.
Not relevant. We all know we are trying to change the current law from its 300 feet distance.
Right, but you've already voted to say now you can get it at least 30 feet. But now you're also saying as a conditional feet, you can go less than 30 feet. And the current one you have now is 300.
Yes, that's what I just said.
Wireless companies warn their shareholders of risk in their annual reports, but not their customers or their residents. So I have here 2 quotes from the annual reports of Crown Castle and Verizon. We also have on our website at ehtrust.org many of the other Sprint, AT&T, Vodafone, and other telecom companies and their statements, which are all kind of similar. So Crown Castle says, the frequency emissions from wireless handsets or equipment on our communications infrastructure are demonstrated to cause negative health effects, potential future claims, could adversely affect our operations, costs, or revenues. We currently do not maintain any significant insurance with respect to these matters. And Verizon says, they say a lot more than this, is just 2 quotes. We may incur significant expenses in defending these lawsuits. In addition, we may be required to pay significant awards or settlements. Right now, there's actually, there is a case that's been winding through the courts for years, over a decade. Most of the people in the case have passed away, but they are alleging that their tumors are from their heavy cell phone use. And that is what we believe that particular reference is to. And many of the telecom companies are involved in that lawsuit and named. Insurance companies refuse to cover 5G or sell actually electromagnetic radiation as the industry standard in the United States because the risk is ranked as high. And that image that says the next asbestos was one of the many white papers by insurance authorities where they compare the issue to asbestos. And just recently, Swiss Re released their report rating 5G as off the leash, a high impact emerging risk, and the EMF exclusion is applied as an industry standard for insurance, for your home, for many companies, even for cities as a standard. And that's just an example of the City of Ann Arbor, Michigan insurance policy, which says that it is excluded, the policy does not apply to electromagnetic radiation. And also, the companies themselves, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, when they sell you insurance for your phone, they define pollution as including magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, microwaves, all artificially produced ionizing or non-ionizing radiation or waste. So the companies define it as a pollution. Insurance companies won't insure it, and yet this is being placed in front of our homes. There's so much to talk about, and I would urge you to go online if you want to. If you're new to this issue, Environmental Health Trust has a YouTube channel where we have a lot of our professional talks and community talks, which are online, and you can learn so much about this issue. But I did want to share a few pieces of the science, and then I thought we could have a Q&A. This was a really important paper published where they looked at Austin, Texas as an example and asked the question, if we were to deploy 5G millimeter wave in Austin, Texas, what would the power density of the radio frequency radiation, that's the radiation emanating from the cell tower, the cell antennas, be? And on one side is the current map with the LTE network. And if you look at, you see all these different colors. Engineers use this. We have published research using these kind of the colors, which represent the intensity, the values. It's kind of like a heat map. And on the other side is if 5G millimeter wave deployment was fully deployed, the engineers actually put in what would the network need to be fully deployed. And then they looked at what the levels would be. And they found it went up significantly. And there is several studies which have already been completed. They've looked at cities that have had the densification of 5G small cells, which are not always 5G, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and then which haven't, and they find, as you would expect, that the ambient, the environmental levels of radio frequency radiation does increase when you add hundreds of thousands of new antennas into communities. So 5G is going to mean, let me give you another picture to just go back to this for a second, is going to mean hundreds of thousands of new of these shorter 5G cell towers, which actually oftentimes will be popped on with 4G antennas. A lot of people ask, well, what are the frequencies that they're going to be emitting? They will be emitting low band, mid band, and high band frequency. 5G is not just about the higher frequencies. However, in addition to the frequencies we already have in use in the United States and internationally, there will be added new higher frequencies that have never been used commercially and so widespread before, the sub-millimeter and millimeter waves. So it is adding into the mix new frequencies, as well as the older frequencies we've already have, the lower band. So T-Mobile, for example, is using very low band frequencies. In the cities, it might be using the higher frequencies.
So, with that said, let me talk a little bit about spectrum. And you've heard this from several of the speakers before. Michelle touched on this, Ken touched on this too. And I do want to bust a couple of myths while I'm up here. All of the spectrum bands are going to be needed for 5G. You need millimeter wave in the dense urban areas. You need midband. Ken covered that. That's how you deliver a breadth of mobility and experience in a 5G world. And you need low band. You have to have connectivity. You have to have that across all of rural America. You have to have that for the IoT and critical services that we talk about so much that 5G can bring. The industry was led by a millimeter wave story. But we all know, engineers in the room, anybody who studied this industry, it is basic math and physics. You cannot cover 3 million square miles of the US with millimeter wave. It is physically impossible. You can try and tell me the world is flat all you want. I tell you it's not, right? And it's going to be super, super hard to make that happen, if not impossible. I don't care how many small cells you build.
There's going to be new modulations and ways that the antennas will deliver the signal, which I'm not going to go into deeply right here, except to say that hundreds of scientists are calling to halt the deployment of this technology because it will increase the levels, and because we know from the research base that we have now, published scientific evidence, that there are bioeffects at very low levels well below what our government allows. So I'll briefly talk about that. And Dr. Leonard Hardell, who studied Agent Orange in the 80s, is one of the world's experts on wireless radiation. He was a member of the World Health Organization International Agency for Research on Cancer Working Group. And back in 2011, when they classified it as a possible carcinogen. And he now has published, along with environmental health trust scientists and other scientists, publications and research that indicates that wireless radio frequency radiation, as would be emitted from 5G and small cell towers, the 4G towers, should be a human carcinogen.
I mean, if you can't do anything else, you create doubt. I mean, like a book which is written, doubt is their product, which comes from industry. So I would say that the situation just now is more alike than this. And we need people to waken up. The scientific data are there. It's clearly this type of radiation is dangerous to human health and maybe to nature. And I would say that it's time to act and not to let 5G to be implemented all over the world until research has been done.
The combined evidence, in my view, is that there is now sufficient evidence that radio frequency radiation is carcinogenic to humans. That's IR category 1, and you can't ignore that. And the implications of this, we have to be cautious. Radio frequency radiation is now ubiquitous. We're probably exposed to it in this room, even though we do not want to be. And we know that although the risk per individual is low, the radiation is widely distributed. I was astounded when I went up one of your peaks to find a cell tower at the top of the tram. My goodness, what are they doing to people? And when we continue doing this, this could result in major public health problems.
And there are many other impacts, not just cancer, actually, but we do have a lot of data from people who've used cell phones, as well as the National Toxicology Program study. They've also found DNA damage to brain development, headaches, so many effects, oxidative stress, which can lead to a myriad of other health issues. There was just the Swiss government expert group issued a publication reviewing studies on oxidative stress and concluded that the elderly and the young would be most at risk. And again, confirming the published science. All this talk about that there is no science that you may hear, or people who post things on listservs like we did about this group and they hear back that there's no science, that's simply not true. There's numerous published studies showing harm. An article in the Lancet, which is a very respected publication, by Dr. Bandara and Dr. Carpenter, talking about the recent evaluation of 2,266 studies, found most studies have demonstrated significant biological health effects associated with exposure to anthropogenic electromagnetic fields. And that doesn't even count the research going back even earlier. So there has been research since the Cold War and before that showing effects. In fact, our government worked very hard to investigate this, as did the Russian government, because of soldiers working with radar. In talking about the higher frequencies, one of the issues that's being raised by the higher frequencies, among many, is the impact to the bees and to insects. Because as the size of the wave matches the size of the insect, so it can resonate and be more highly absorbed. This study, I'm just showing you images from a study. Again, it looks like a heat map. Looked at the higher frequencies on the honeybee, and they looked at 5 insects. They also looked at insects at various, they looked at the bee at different stages of the life cycle, and found that the higher frequencies resonated with the bee and were much more highly absorbed and could impact the bee's behavior because of biochemical changes that can happen because of that. There are many other studies which we have on our website showing impacts to honey production, to reproduction of bees, where bees didn't come back to a hive when wireless radiation was placed near it.
For decades, there has been irrefutable evidence that electromagnetic waves have an influence, both thermally and non-thermally, on living beings, including people.
5G has triggered irrational fears, but experts are also concerned. Daniel Favre is among hundreds of scientists who think precautionary steps should be taken. He signed appeals sent to the United Nations and European Union asking for the health effects of it to be reassessed. Daniel has been looking into the impact of electromagnetic fields on honeybees for years.
This cell phone emits the waves, while this one receives the waves. At the same time, I have a device that records the sound that the colony makes in the beehive. This is why it is connected to a microphone placed under the beehive. Look at the waveform there. The thicker it is, the greater the intensity of the sound. When the phones are active, the colony is disturbed, and as soon as the phone's turned off, the colony reverts to its normal noise.
Implementing 5G safely for people and the environment requires more time for independent research and to better digest the information already available in the thousands of papers that have been published on it. This is what Enrico Stura told us. He is an electronic engineer specializing in molecular biophysics.
The
electromagnetic waves produced by personal telecommunication systems during reasonable periods of time lead to demonstrable and proven DNA damages.
There's a study, radio frequency radiation injures trees around mobile phone base stations, that was a field study that went for years looking at different trees and communities and took pictures every year, and they found that trees which were in line of sight of the cell antennas had damage and over time ultimately needed to be felled. So here you can see where there's the antenna. This is one of the pictures. And then you see the thinning out of the crown. There's studies that have looked at impacts to plants and have found biological effects. So we have quite a situation if we're going to be peppering all of Montgomery County and all of the United States and the world with these antennas. We have a web page on Environmental Health Trust, and I'll be putting the link in as soon as I'm done with this to a page that links to all of this. But on property value drops, Montgomery County has documented in filings that there would be drops in property value associated with a small cell in front of a home. They are ugly. They have big equipment boxes. And if you can choose a house, would you choose a house with an antenna in front of it or not? So one thing I want to point out related to the frequencies is, and I don't quite understand why companies are just pushing all of these antennas and these poles in front of our homes when they really don't have to be, because they're not putting in the higher millimeter wave necessarily. So something you need to know is that once you get a street light or a utility pole or a new pole or a cell tower, and it is a cell antenna site, then there is federal law that dictates how you, for example, add new antennas, or you can make it taller, and all of these other things which allow what starts out as one antenna to be two, to be three, and also allows it to go higher. You can swap out the antenna for another kind of antenna with very little public process, which is a serious part of the problem. There are hundreds of scientists calling to halt 5G. You can go to our website to see some of the appeals from all around the world. There was just a consensus statement of United Kingdom and international medical and scientific experts. And then, of course, there's the 5G appeal to the European Union, the EMF scientist appeal, and so forth. And it seems like every week there's something new.
I've spent over 40 years in the technology industry. My most recent position was president of Microsoft Canada, and I've seen the tremendous benefit technology can provide. I've also seen the potential harm if technology is not used correctly. In my opinion, our current implementation of wireless technology is not safe, and I'm especially concerned with our plans for 5G. I don't make this statement lightly. I've met with experts from institutions such as Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and the University of Toronto, and I've met with an expert advisor to the World Health Organization and one of the lead scientific writers for Al Gore's team that won the Nobel Prize. Over 250 scientists from 40 countries signed a formal appeal to the World Health Organization and the United Nations member states expressing their concern over the harmful effects of wireless technology, and added an additional appeal for the effects of 5G, especially the effects on children. Hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers have been published demonstrating harm to humans and the environment.
There are protests happening around the world. There's so much research, and people say, well, how did we get in this situation? There is a Harvard report, Captured Agency, how the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates, which is a key piece of the puzzle. They talk about how Norm Elster, the investigative reporter, talks about how there is so much money going to Congress. The Federal Communications Commission has former lawyers, industry insiders, former head lobbyists, and they are using big tobacco tactics. Everyone asks, what is the standard that we have in the United States? We have limits that were set in 1996. They're based on short-term heating effects, not long-term effects. Science from the 70s and 80s underpins it, small animal science actually, those limits that we have right now. They've remained largely unchanged, and they don't look at the relevant characteristics of exposure that are relevant to understanding how it might impact us. So, for example, modulation, polarization, data rate, and there are many other characteristics of the exposure are important when understanding how we would be affected. In addition, the person who is affected. So, for example, children are more vulnerable. And this has been published in terms of how they are more exposed, more of their bodies exposed, their brains, their eyes absorb more of this radiation. In addition, they have developing brains, and small impacts can have large effects later, as you know. They have developing eyes, and all of this is not included in the limits that we have. So that's why we are actually part of a historic legal appeal against the FCC with Consumers for Safer Cell Phones, Children's Health Defense, and several petitioners in the case. We are arguing that the FCC made a decision not to update the limits for cell towers, cell phones, for wireless radiation, and we are arguing that they haven't adequately reviewed the record, because on the record of the FCC is thousands and thousands of pages of published science, people documenting how they've been harmed, and more. And the FCC just pretty much ignored it, especially with 5G. They need to be taking the time to set limits that are protective, and we are hoping that they will ask the EPA and relevant agencies to do so. We had oral arguments January 25th, and it went better than could be expected.
Note that the exposure from each portable or mobile device near a person will generally involve low total power absorption while being highly localized, and will not result in significant contributions to whole body average.
And what are you citing for that conclusion? I don't see any authority cited or any study or any explanation of how you came to that conclusion, other than that just conclusory statement. The footnote.
You're correct. Well, you're correct. How did we decide that the localized exposure would be absorbed in our
multiple localized exposures for prolonged periods of time?
How that would not be harmful?
Yeah, how did you decide that?
Well, again, I think you have to link the observations here with the observations we made in concluding the notice of inquiry. You're correct. There is no footnote here, but if you go back to the resolution terminating the notice of inquiry, we said repeatedly that there was no evidence of any effect, not just cancer, any illness from radio frequency emissions below our existing levels. And in fact, we said below, at, and sometimes even above our existing
And that
levels.
one said, sorry, can you point me to that paragraph where it said, where it was addressing cumulative impacts?
Again, I apologize if I'm not being responsive to your question, but the cumulative effects are addressed here in addition to 1.1307.
And you're referring back to findings that were not themselves cumulative.
No, the scientific conclusions here are cumulative. The scientific studies that the FDA and others have looked at, and
no, the FDA didn't. The FDA was only talking about cell phones. That's my point. That's what there could well be. It's a very big record, and you know better than me. There could very well be something where it was clear that you were relying on either your own determinations rather than just conclusions, or there's another FDA somewhere else, or another agency talked about cumulative exposures from multiple devices over a prolonged period of time for physical impacts other than cancer. And is that, you're telling me that was made at the beginning, cumulative?
I don't know that we used the word cumulative in terminating the notice of inquiry.
Judge Robert L. Wilkins actually said, I'm going to be very upfront with why I'm inclined to rule against you.
It was reasonable for us to rely on
Can I explain my problem? I'm just going to be very upfront with why I am inclined to rule against you. So I want you to tell me why I shouldn't have the concern that I do.
And he asks, why didn't the FDA actually request information from the committees that they have that have expertise in this area?
And you say that Congress directed the FDA to establish an electronic product radiation control program designed to protect the public health and safety from electronic product radiation. The statute that you cite there is section, it's 21 USC section 360 II. When I read that, it says that basically the way that is done is that a committee that is established in a cross-reference to 360 KK will be established that will review these standards for testing and emissions level. Okay? But you don't reference that committee anywhere, and I don't see anything about that committee mentioned in the administrative record.
And he asked questions about the interagency work group for radiofrequency radiation that the United States actually, we know, used to have, but as far as we know right now has not met in 2 years.
Then later on in your brief at page 37, you say not to worry because the FCC stands ready to consider changing exposure limits in appropriate circumstances. And you refer to a radio frequency interagency working group that maintains a continuing dialogue between the FCC and the FDA about these issues. And that's referred to in a letter. Or you say that it's referred to in a letter. But when I read that letter, I don't see any mention of that working group, and I don't see anything in the record that says that working group actually exists or looked at any of the evidence in this case. So the problem that I have is that you say that you're relying on the expertise of the FDA, but the entity that Congress specifically said to review this committee, you've given us no evidence that this committee has looked at any of this. And then you say that in the future, to the extent anything needs to be looked at, it's going to be looked at by this working group. But I don't see any evidence that the working group looked at anything this time. So why shouldn't I send it back for the relevant working groups and the FDA to look at this record?
Now, this questioning to the FCC took place in the second half of the oral arguments. FCC counsel Ashley Boisel stated that there is a scientific consensus. They referred to other expert organizations and bodies, citing the World Health Organization and the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection.
So as I said, the FDA said in its letter at JA 8187 that it was engaged in an ongoing review of the evidence in this area. And then, as you say, it represented a specific conclusion with respect to the National Toxicology Program's research on cell phones. But that was coupled with representations in our termination of the notice of inquiry at JA 12 that the World Health Organization had found no substantiated adverse effects from fixed facilities. So this wasn't an inquiry that was limited narrowly.
You are way more expert than me. Is an iPad a fixed facility?
No, an iPad is not a fixed facility.
Is a watch a fixed facility? No.
Right.
Okay. Is a wireless laptop a fixed facility?
No, but
when the notice of inquiry talked about the ubiquitous use of devices, was it talking about fixed facilities?
No, not exclusively, but I was going to.
No, but I don't think that was okay. I get that, but
I apologize for not being responsive.
The fixed facility stuff, to me at least, doesn't feel responsive unless I'm misunderstanding it. I'm really curious about all these other devices.
what I'm doing is referring to our explanation of why the existing limits continue to be sufficient. And what we said in terminating the notice of inquiry is that the scientific evidence, and we relied on the FDA, but we also referred to other expert organizations and bodies, that the scientific consensus had not changed. And I think it's a mistake to characterize what we did as relying exclusively on the FDA's conclusions, because that's not what we did here. We also looked to the views of, as I said, the World Health Organization at JA12, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, the National Toxicology Program scientists themselves said don't rely on this rat study and extrapolate to humans.
Now, I'd like to point out that the World Health Organization EMF project, which the FCC counsel Ashley Boisel is referring to, is actually, according to a published article that is in the FCC record, an entity with long-standing conflicts of interest. And Dr. Leonard Hardell's paper on the World Health Organization called A Hard Nut to Crack documents how the fact sheets that the World Health Organization has online have, I would say, less than transparent origins. And at Environmental Health Trust, we actually have been writing the World Health Organization EMF project, and we have been asking for information as to who wrote the fact sheets, what they are based on, and so forth, because these fact sheets downplay, whitewash the actual body of evidence on electromagnetic radiation, and they're used the world over as proof of safety, when in fact what we know is that the staff at the World Health Organization EMF project is actually one engineer without a medical background, and she refuses to answer our questions, try as we might, simply to know who wrote the fact sheets and how they were written. What was the process by which they were written?
In 2011, the Cancer Institute of World Health Organization, with the help of 31 experts from all around the world, classified radiofrequency radiation, including mobile phone radiation, as possibly carcinogenic. And 3 weeks later, it was very strange because the World Health Organization headquarters issued a fact sheet that dismissed the cancer risks and the cancer classification.
Whilst the IARC classification covers all radio frequencies, fact sheet 193 only refers to mobile phones. This creates the impression that the classification does not apply to other uses of radio frequencies, such as masts, Wi-Fi, DECT phones, radars, and industrial uses. But the sentence, "To date, no adverse health effects have been established as being caused by mobile phone use," fails to reflect the accumulating body of evidence. This WHO wording is strangely reminiscent of the discourse of the manufacturers who demand the highest level of scientific evidence.
And the very fact that you can interpret this sentence as contradictory, that means that it's not very clear. It is even a bit misleading. So we asked the WHO in Geneva to correct that part of the fact sheet.
Soit corrigé dans leur fact sheet. Mais malheureusement,
but unfortunately, I've checked, the sentence is still there.
This key sentence has enabled manufacturers to deliver a message downplaying the IARC classification, which actually recognizes some tentative evidence for the increase in cancers due to exposure to radio frequencies.
I wanted to know, I asked the responsible person at the World Health Organization, Emily van Deventer, who were the experts that wrote this fact sheet, this new information that was contradicting the Cancer Institute classification, and I had no answer.
Emily van Deventer is the current head of the EMF project within the World Health Organization. In June 2006, she replaced Michael Repaccioli, who she had assisted since the year 2000.
So when I met Emily van Deventer, in Brussels 5 months later. I confronted her with my email and I said I didn't never get any reply to my question, and I repeated my question. Who are the experts that you consulted and helped you write this fact sheet? And she still refused to answer to this very simple question. Who are the experts?
This one was just updated.
Yes, but who wrote it?
I am in charge of the fact sheet.
You wrote
and
it?
That the sentences that
They're updated
and then
with
it is a corporate fact sheet. It is not my fact sheet.
Yes, but who wrote it?
Who changed the sentence?
Yes, was it you or did you consult external
I changed
experts?
the sentence. I consulted with a number of experts.
Who were they?
And I have to ask my administration if that is an acceptable question.
Emily van Deventer has no specialist knowledge in the field of health. She is an electrical engineer with expertise in electromagnetic fields. She is a member of the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which originally set the international standards for public exposure to mobile phones. Emily van Deventer was a lecturer in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department of the University of Toronto in Canada. Here she carried out research financed by the telecommunications companies Bell Canada and Nortel before joining the WHO. During her public health role, Emily van Deventer remained in close contact with scientists who work for the industry. She co-wrote an article questioning the principle of precaution with some vocal defenders of the interests of electricity companies. In 2006, she joined Michael Repiccioli and Peter Valberg from the product defense consultancy Gradient in signing an article supporting the theory that electromagnetic waves pose no danger to the public.
So we don't know for sure. We don't know how these cases are going to go, but we were quite impressed, and we believe that the judges really read our briefs. And they also unpacked the reality, which I didn't even mention on this call because there's so much about this issue, which is that the Environmental Protection Agency was defunded. Actually, one of the reasons they haven't done anything is they were defunded in 1996 when they were creating safety limits. But Montgomery County actually filed an appeal, the Federal Court of Appeals, related to this issue. They filed that how can we be forced to put these small cells up when the FCC has not updated their safety limits since 1996? So because that had not been concluded, the court hadn't made its determination in court at the time, Andrew Friedson and others thought, well, how can we move forward on this? We don't have an answer from that court case. Now, what ended up happening was the FCC, that case was actually made moot. And the FCC said, well, we've made a determination, we have reviewed the docket, and there's no reason to update the limits.
May it please the court. I'm Eric Godding, and I'm going to be discussing the radio frequency or RF issue, and I'd like to reserve 1 minute. Montgomery County's concern is what the FCC has yet to say. In response to rulemaking comments that the FCC's RF exposure standards may not reflect the current safety research or account for this new 5G environment that we're going to see in the coming years, and that the FCC must resolve those issues before accelerating the siting and the operation of these 5G small cells on public rights-of-way, the FCC offered a single sentence. It said it disagreed with any concerns that Montgomery County or others have.
I guess the issue which has been raised in the 28J letters is mootness, given the completion of this rulemaking, which had begun much earlier. So why don't you address that?
So the burden in this court is heavy on the FCC. It has to show that there's no possible way for this court to give any relief. And so in our case, we're asking the FCC to explain in the context of this order why RF is either irrelevant or why it thinks it's important and how it's going to resolve this issue.
Why shouldn't you now? I mean, your complaint originally in the briefs was that the FCC should have completed this rulemaking.
Yes.
During the pendency of this appeal. They have now done that, and so why would you not raise any challenges you have to that rulemaking in a separate petition?
I would disagree that they have done that. They've done two things in those 6 pages where they close out the NOI. They talk about cell phones, which are not small cells, and then they have some conclusory statements that the record doesn't show that they need to update these RF standards. But nowhere in those 6 pages do they ever discuss the 5G environment. They don't discuss densification. They don't discuss the use of millimeter waves.
Yeah, that may be, right. But why wouldn't the appropriate process here be for Montgomery County to now challenge that other rulemaking? Because the thrust of the argument initially was they just haven't completed the rulemaking, but now they've completed it. So why wouldn't you may have good arguments against that rulemaking, but how do we dispose of them in this case?
Because we didn't get the relief. If we have to go back to court and take another year to litigate this, we're not getting the relief that we want, because it's our position that they actually haven't addressed the issue. Montgomery County wants to be able to tell its citizens it's putting these 5G small cells on its property. And the citizens are asking, is this safe? Or can we walk on our sidewalks? And if we have to go back and litigate for another year, that's a year that the carriers and the FCC is allowing these to be deployed. And so we have the evidence in the record showing that these may be dangerous, maybe they're not. But we don't have the answer to that question. And I think is...
We don't have the later action before us.
But they've raised the mootness issue, so I think the court now has the obligation to decide it. So, but I think on its face, I don't think the court has to do a lot of work.
Review the merits.
No, you don't have to.
To me, you're really disagreeing with the merits of that.
No, we're not disagreeing with the merits. I think on its face, they didn't address this issue. I don't think the court needs to dig into the record or anything. I think on its face, it literally decided not to address the issue that we asked, which was to clarify, is this a potential risk or isn't it? And so we can go back to our citizens and we can take whatever steps we need to take to deal with these new small cells. And so I think in the context, I think our case is rather simple. It's kind of an APA case. In this order, our order, not the one we were just talking about, they don't explain their decision. They had a single sentence. Despite the fact that you have this huge record of concern, of studies, of research.
So, counsel, in the other matter, the matter that's closed, is that subject to appeal? Have you taken a notice of appeal on that one?
Yes.
Being arbitrary and capricious? Is that pending, and where is that pending?
So there are 2 cases, one here in the 9th that I know of, one here in the 9th and one in the DC Circuit.
Are they going to be consolidated?
Yes, I think under 2112, yes, they'd be consolidated.
You know where they're going to be consolidated?
I think DC won the race to the courthouse.
And when are those going to be heard?
We don't know yet. They were just filed. So I see I have 1 more minute left, and I'd like to reserve that for any rebuttal.
Thank you.
So then that case actually became moot. And we actually expected that Montgomery County would have done the case that we are doing, which is contesting that the FCC actually reviewed the record, because it's quite clear that they did not. And during oral arguments, the judges were they grilled the FCC in court at the hearing, January 25th. 4 amicus briefs were filed in support of Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC. The Natural Resources Defense Council, which included elected officials in several states and Maryland, Joe Sondry, president of the National Spectrum Management Association, the Building Biology Institute, and Dan and Catherine Kleiber. I'll quote from the Natural Resources Defense Council brief. Numerous scientific studies were available to the FCC if it had taken its environmental review responsibilities seriously. Instead, the FCC stuck its head in the sand and did not even mention many of these studies of potential environmental harm in its 2019 order. And that amicus brief reviews the history of the wireless radiation standards in the United States. It is an absolute must-read. Very importantly, the NRDC brief was signed on to by officials, especially from Tacoma Park. Thank you, Tacoma Park, our mayor, council members, and also elected officials from Massachusetts, California, Hawaii, and Michigan. The amicus brief of telecom attorney Joe Sandry includes a declaration by Dr. Linda Birnbaum. Now, Dr. Linda Birnbaum is a 40-year U.S. government scientist. She recently retired after a decade of serving as our director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. She's navigated numerous controversies about pollution and human health because the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has conducted many studies addressing hot regulatory issues such as air pollution and chemical exposure issues. And in the brief, she talks about the importance of the National Toxicology Program study on cell phone radiation. I will quote her. The National Toxicology Program studies tested non-thermal levels of radiofrequency radiation for toxicological potential, including carcinogenic activity, and relied on controlled chronic exposures to levels of radiofrequency radiation that do not significantly increase temperature. Overall, the NTP studies demonstrate the potential for radiofrequency radiation to cause cancer in humans. What's really important about the NTP study is that the levels of exposure were non-thermal. So when you hear that there is no way that non-ionizing radiation could cause harm because the only harm it causes is heat, that has been proven wrong by the National Toxicology Program study on cell phone radiofrequency radiation. In her declaration, Dr. Birnbaum cites published articles by Dr. Ronald Melnick. Now, he is another NIH scientist. He has been working with the U.S. government for 28 years. And of course, he's now retired, and he's published on this issue because he led the study design for the National Toxicology Program study on cell phone radiation. Now that he's retired, he's given several talks on the relevance of the NTP study on cell phone radiation in terms of human health. And I'm going to share with you a short clip from one of many talks Dr. Melnick has made. He's one of Environmental Health Trust's advisors, and he talks about the relevance of the NTP study in terms of understanding 5G and radiofrequency radiation or wireless radiation and human health. This is a short clip from the end of his talk.
What does the public need to know? There have been multiple studies have found increases in cancer associated with exposure to radiofrequency radiation. This is animals and humans. Because of the widespread use of cell phones, even a small increase in cancer risk would have a serious public health impact. I strongly feel precautionary principles should be promoted by health and regulatory agencies, especially for children and pregnant women. The agencies in the US say, if you are concerned, that puts the burden on the individual. It doesn't say, we are concerned. It should be very straightforward. Precautionary principles should be promoted because, as mentioned earlier, risk can be greater for children than adults due to the increased penetration of the radiation within brains of children, and the developing nervous system is more susceptible to tissue-damaging agents. So finally, what is the lesson that should be learned? When dealing with assumptions, I think we've shown that assumptions in this case can be wrong, so that we should no longer assume that any current or future wireless technology, including 5G, is safe without adequate testing. Thank you.
The Building Biology Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that educates environmental consultants and electromagnetic radiation specialists, detailed the many stories of people who have been injured by radiofrequency radiation. And I'll quote, "The imposition of radiofrequency radiation contamination costs without fair compensation on people and businesses affects the entire population, but falls most cruelly and tragically on poor people, minorities, and the elderly, who have no medical, legal, or economic recourse at all. They are trapped." And you can read that, of course, online at environmentalhealthtrust.org. In addition, Dan and Catherine Kleiber tell their family story, and they make many arguments in their amicus brief, and I'll quote them. The FCC is obligated to prepare an environmental assessment due to both the differing environmental and public health impacts endangered by the choice between keeping radiofrequency microwave radiation limits the same versus lowering them. and the vastly disparate energy footprint of the wired versus wireless technologies and the implications for the future survival of the human race. The Kleiber's brief highlights the comments made by injured individuals in FCC docket 1384, that's one of the dockets in our case, showing that the FCC is violating human rights, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act by not enacting biologically based population and environmentally protective safety standards for the radiation emitted by wireless technology. What's happened now that is mind-blowing is that the FCC, when it made its determination that they didn't need to update their limits, which is why we have our lawsuit against them, but now they have made a new proposed rule about the higher frequencies for 5G. And also for lower frequencies, they've made new, I don't want to call them safety standards because they're not really safety standards, but they're being used as safety standards for a whole swatches of new frequencies, much lower than wireless and higher into the millimeter wave. And they're saying that the only thing to worry about is heat, because that's been proven because of their determination in 2019. The city of Boston, Massachusetts wrote to the FCC regarding the FCC's frequencies, 5G frequencies, asking the commission to examine the impact on health of the low-level multiple exposures. There have been for years now elected officials sending letters to the FCC asking for 5G safety data. If you don't know about the New Hampshire Commission report on 5G health and environment, really important to know what they did. They issued a final report after 1 year of investigation. Their commissioners had members of the House of Representatives and Senate, engineers and experts. They had presentations by expert scientists and the National Institutes of Health, and they issued 15 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are recommendations to the state to protect the public and the environment and reduce exposure. Starting with something we need well, you would think we would need before we roll anything out, that the state, or in our situation, I'm going to take it to Montgomery County, should be measuring the radio frequency radiation levels and post maps of the radio frequency levels for the public. They also are calling to require that 5G structures be labeled for radio frequency radiation at eye level and readable from 9 feet away. Now, France is kind of sort of doing this to a degree in that they just started. These are their radiation measurement sites in France. And actually, many countries, but not the United States, measure and publish radio frequency radiation levels online. Some do real-time measurements. Some of these measurements I can't say are quite adequate. Some are in better positions than others. Sometimes the websites don't work. Some have these real-time monitors near schools and other locations, but not Montgomery County or the United States. They recommend an independent study of 5G health effects and that the FCC should do an environmental assessment on the impact of 5G. That federal agencies be engaged with ecological knowledge to develop radio frequency limits that protect trees, plants, birds, insects, and pollinators. And I hope, if I haven't, I might not have been clear, that the limits that we have in the United States, we're not set to protect the environment, but only to avoid heating. But they're really aimed at humans. They're inadequate to protect humans, but they have nothing to do with trees or plants or wildlife. They were never developed for impacts to the environment. This is a serious gap in accountability. There is a letter from the EPA to myself where this was confirmed. When I asked several questions, but I just put a couple in here. I asked who's researched birds and bees. The EPA responded they don't have a funded mandate. When I asked about research on damage to memory and other things, they referred me to a 1984 document called The Biological Effects of Radiofrequency Radiation from 1984. And there's no one watching the store on this issue. There's no one in the federal government that is mandated to look at the research that continues to be published every week, indicating that wireless radiation is not safe, and if 5G is going to increase it, we are looking at unprecedented levels of this radiation, and that's why so many scientists are concerned. They also recommend a multimedia campaign to educate people on how to minimize radio frequency radiation, especially for children and pregnant women. They recommend wireless radiation-free zones, and that the medical community develop protections and protocols for people harmed by electromagnetic fields. I have an image here from the Archbishop Makarios Hospital in Cyprus, where they have removed Wi-Fi from the pediatric and neonatal units. And they actually have a national campaign educating parents on how to reduce exposure to wireless radiation. I was just part of the electromagnetic field medical conference that was held in California in 2019, and now it was virtual with COVID here in the United States, but training medical doctors on how to treat EMF-associated illness. They also recommended software to reduce radiation exposure into the body, that schools and libraries replace Wi-Fi with Ethernet connections and hardwired connections, and that there be the deployment of fiber optic connectivity to homes and wired connections inside homes and schools. So right now I'm talking to you on a computer. This is my computer, actually. It's a picture of my computer. And this is the setup. I have an adapter and I have an Ethernet cord, and everything is wired. It's more secure. It's fast. My Zoom calls don't drop. And I am not connecting with anything outside. And having wired connections reduces the overall need to use wireless. So wherever I can, I have wired connections. I have a wired telephone as well. Now, one of the myths about this issue that in Montgomery County keeps getting propagated somehow is that we need this for a virtual school. We need 5G for all of these applications. But when you unpack what's being said, actually, a lot of it isn't so. So for example, for schools, people need modems and connectivity in their homes. They should not be on a cell phone connecting to an outside tower for school. There needs to be access to the internet for everyone. But even if I was in a house, I don't want to be connecting to an outside tower. You connect to the service in your home. People need service in their home, and they need financial help to get that service. I did another talk just recently, and someone said, look, my MiFi, or it's called MiFi, I think they're giving that to the kids too, is $17 a month. That's how much I pay. I can't afford the $60 to $100 that the other services require I pay. So this is what we have to address to bridge the digital divide. And just recently, lawmakers in New York put forward proposed legislation, which would be similar to the New Hampshire Commission legislation that created it. And so that's it's really exciting that they've introduced a bill to create a special commission charged with investigating the evidence linking radio frequency radiation to health and environmental effects. The Green Party of California issued a statement on 5G wireless technology calling to apply the precautionary principle and to reduce exposure. This is one of our handouts that goes into all what's happening around the world. There are 600 municipalities in Italy where the mayors or the elected officials have passed resolutions to halt 5G. There are many, many actions happening worldwide. There is ample research that shows that because of the sheer amount of small cell towers and the billions of new things which will be connecting to the towers, that there will be increases in energy consumption, even though we are in a time where companies, and we're all working hard but companies are working hard to have their facilities more energy efficient. And it is true that a small cell compared to a cell tower will have less power. However, 5G is an energy hog. And there have been several reports on this by industry themselves, where they talk about how are they going to fund all the new energy bill that they're going to have for their infrastructure. There are climate think tanks that have put forward calls to reduce our consumption of digital technology because how the Internet of Things is going to use so much more energy. And this is just a fact. And also some 5G base stations are being turned off in China because they use so much energy, and this is a new kind of technology that is not going to overall cut our energy expenditures, at least not from what industry itself is reporting in their own reports. So I have here Montgomery County local groups, and there are many homeowners associations and other groups that have testified and are opposed to forced cell towers in front of their homes with no routine notice or hearings. So there's MoCo SafeG, Small Cells Montgomery County Blogspot, TechWise MoCo MD, and mc4t.org. And again, a letter writing campaign. I have it in the chat. The actionnetwork.org has the ability to have a letter writing campaign where you can send a letter, you can use a template that's already there. We hope everyone will write our elected members of the city council, set meetings with them, educate your neighbors. On the left side, there is a lot of resources put together educating people about the issue, links to not just the science, but property value and all the issues related to this ZTA. Montgomery County actually did a measurement study of the radio frequency radiation from cell towers. They looked at towers that had one antenna, short, small cells, and then some that had what they called worst case scenario with 3 antennas. And they used the technical specs from Crown Castle and so forth, and they determined how, like the radio frequency radiation, how it emanated off the small cell site. For the worst case scenario, which is not as worse as it can be actually, they found that the radio frequency radiation exceeded limits up to 10 feet, exceeded FCC limits, which are sky high and non-protective, but off the antenna, and that there shouldn't be a building up to 10 feet. Now, this raises some really important issues. One, it confirms that, as we know, by the way, that oftentimes when antennas are placed, they're exceeding FCC limits near the antenna. So for example, there are apartment buildings where they have antennas placed and there's no routine monitoring happening where we even know what the levels are. But when there has been, they find it exceeds levels outside in front of the antenna. Now you might say, well, what does that matter? How does that affect me? Well, I know that my daughter would play on a tree, which was literally right up to the edge in our old house. There was a tree, it was right next to the front street, and she would play in that tree. That tree would be right under where the antenna would be. What if she climbed the tree? She always climbs trees. My kids climb trees. And that would be a case where she shouldn't be climbing that tree because it's right there. What about workers who are working on the lines? There are many cases of workers being injured. HVAC workers especially who are working on buildings. What about if it falls over? Is there a switch to turn off the transmission, and can we reach it? Can we get in to turn it off if a car bumps into it? What about pedestrians being impacted by these new poles, these bulky equipment pieces? Okay, I got diverted from the radiation. Back to the radiation issue. So if at 10 feet, if there's a circumference of 10 feet that exceeds limits, according to the Montgomery County report on this issue, what does that mean for our trees, birds, and bees? And how is it okay to allow excesses of the FCC limit? Many countries are measuring this. In France, If you want to know what your radio frequency level is outside your house, you go to your mayor, and he or she has to come up, has to have someone measure the limits, the levels, and tell you what they are by law. They passed a law in 2015, one of the best laws by a federal government. There are groups in every state at this point. People are organizing on this issue. Communicate with your neighbors, have talks. I am always available to give talks and talk about different dives into sections of this and get people engaged in this issue because, you know, people are waking up to these in front of their children's bedroom windows. And when it is built, it is often too late to move it. So you want to get ahead of the issue and have protective ordinances in place. Now, at the state level, it would be great if the state of Maryland could have a commission on 5G and with independent representation where they looked at this issue. What we need at the federal level, and the reason why Environmental Health Trust stepped into our legal action against the FCC last year, is that we need safety limits that are developed to protect people from these known adverse biological effects. And right now, there's no one watching the store. So the FDA wrote, for example, that there's, you know, the limits don't need to be changed, but they didn't even look at all of the science. They certainly haven't looked at impacts to pollinators or trees or plants or wildlife. So we need, at the federal level, there needs to be an environmental assessment and there needs to be safety standards that protect people. So we need to get eyes, we need to highlight this issue and get people aware of it. Wireless radiation is invisible, so it's easy to ignore it, but we need federal law changed. There are many states around the about half the states in the United States have passed what Campanelli called hoodwink laws, or there are these streamlining laws that, and thankfully not in Maryland, every year this has been stopped, that it has been proposed. But there are laws in several states where they are taking away authority from local communities and are stripping away their authority about where they go or what they look like or the fees and so forth, even more so than at the federal level, because the FCC is doing this too. So those have to be rolled back and changed. I know in Tennessee, there's been a bill proposed to address that as well. The poles, and like, let's say, for example, let's look at all the poles that are 30 feet and over in the county. These could all be possible cell sites with the new ZTA. There are some communities that are advocating for the poles to be 500 to 1,000 feet. And the only way to make them closer than that is to have the companies prove that there is significant gap, that it needs to be there, and that there's not another less obtrusive place for it to be. But just to see what we're talking about in terms of poles, all of these poles are 30 feet away from homes. These are all potential cell sites with the ZTA. Someone asked, couldn't these endanger children's play areas? And yes, that is absolutely, that is how I got interested in this issue, was the impact to children and to children's brains, because it's more and more, and has been actually for a long time, looking like lead. Remember when we put lead, we leaded all our pipes across the nation? I can imagine that if someone said, as they did, because it has been known that lead is toxic, a neurotoxin, for a long, long time, and companies just pushed that as long as they could, that someone said in the government, when someone came and advocated that they not use lead pipes, that, well, you know, it's everywhere, I really can't, you know, everyone's using it. What are you talking about? Well, now, of course, we're doing all this work to fix the lead in our schools, the lead in communities, and we know that there is no safe level of lead. There is no safe level of radio frequency that has been identified because the US government or any government has never looked to develop proper safety limits. What we did, and what the US government did, is adopt the limits of industry industry filled groups to create their limits. And since then, even though US scientists who were experts on this issue over the years, they've written numerous letters that have been unanswered to the heads of the committees that set these limits, pointing out issues related to different tissues and different aspects of the exposure, modulation, and so forth. So these are our US government scientists wrote to the committees that have developed these limits, pointing out problems, were never answered, and there's no process in the US government to then address it. We have these limits from 1996. In fact, I mean, I could talk about bees for an entire hour. There's so much research on bees. The government of India made their standards much more protective based on the research that they did that found impacts to bees and to birds. There's the issue of birds, which is a whole bucket. We have our, I didn't even mention this, I should have, our former lead US Fish and Wildlife Service biologist who has retired, who is submitting information to the FCC on the impacts to birds, bees, and trees. And you shouldn't have to be retired from the federal government to be speaking out on this issue. Dr. Portier, who used to head the National Toxicology Program and worked at the CDC, just came out with a report stating that wireless radio frequency radiation is probably a cause of brain tumors. And that report is part of his expert report on the science in one of the lawsuits I talked about, where people who use cell phones to their head for hours a day developed brain tumors. And that those cases, I believe it's July, this year, July, there's going to be the trial coming up. Susan asked a question about how was it different from last year, and I forgot to add something. So 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I think this has been 6 years now. It's hard to believe, but yeah, it has been. So 2 years ago, when this a similar ZTA came to the council, there were actually amendments that were added that would have given more public hearings and notice to people. And when they were added, and Reamer was the chair of the council at the time, it was tabled and never came back to the floor. So that was how that ended. And there have been packed meeting rooms ever since this began of people, when they realize what's going on here, coming to call to halt this and to have a protective ordinance. And I know that many members of the community have been working on educating the city, the county, and the county executive's office at the time for several years ago about what's possible. And that's what we really need, is a protective ordinance. Montgomery County deserves a protective ordinance for their residents. So Peter asked, what strategies are available for local communities to resist the placement of small cells? Are there legislative actions or regulatory actions that small communities can take to prevent placement in their community? And I think the most important thing right now for Montgomery County is to address this ZTA. It's not just that it needs to be stopped. It's that there needs to be protective zoning put into place that is protective of communities, that restricts the build out unless the companies can show that they have that there is a significant gap and that there's no other place where the infrastructure can be placed. Those ordinances, there was just a talk by Andrew Campanelli, thank you to everyone on the call who helped make that happen, that will be posted soon. But he was talking about how you can have more protective ordinances that simply have a pathway for the companies to get it. You know, if service is being prohibited and you can't make voice calls, then there needs to be a way that companies can put their infrastructure in, because that would violate federal law not to do that. But they have to prove that. It doesn't need to be that we roll out the red carpet, which is what Montgomery County is doing here and what's happening across the country, actually. Susan asked a question about how was it different from last year, and I forgot to add something. So 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I think this has been 6 years now. It's hard to believe, but yeah, it has been. So 2 years ago, when this a similar ZTA came to the council, there were actually amendments that were added that would have given more public hearings and notice to people. And when they were added, and Reamer was the chair of the council at the time, it was tabled and never came back to the floor. So that was how that ended. And there have been packed meeting rooms ever since this began of people, when they realize what's going on here, coming to call to halt this and to have a protective ordinance. And I know that many members of the community have been working on educating the city, the county, and the county executive's office at the time for several years ago about what's possible. And that's what we really need, is a protective ordinance. Montgomery County deserves a protective ordinance for their residents. Industry works every year to try to put forward state streamlining laws, which would strip local authority on this issue. But I have been ever so impressed with the amount of people and the groups from around Maryland that come to stop such laws, which would take away local authority on the matter. So if no one else has any more questions, actually, let me check the Q&A because I was deep in the chat. Do I know where Mark Elrich is now? I know that they have been looking at more protections for residents, as I understand. So I think it would be great to let him know your thoughts. And in the Fed meeting, which you can watch, staff was frankly a little bit shocked that the council members were voting to have poles 30 feet from homes, because it is not necessary to have service to have, as you saw in the map I showed you, all of those streetlights and utility poles be possible sites. I mean, it's simply not necessary for service as far as I understand the case to be. Now, the unfortunate thing is, and why companies are doing this is they just want to put their highways wherever they want to put their highways. They want to put their networks and their systems where they want them to be. They do not want anyone getting in their way, impeding their ability to design the network as they want. And it's not just that there's going to be one pole on your block, because every carrier can have space. So there could be numerous poles, certainly on a city block. I know in Washington, D.C., when they were debating this I think it was an 8-hour hearing. It might have been 8 hours. It was a long hearing in Washington. There's been several hearings in Washington, D.C., but they were talking about several poles on city blocks that would be for small cells. So you have Sprint and you have T-Mobile, you have Verizon. Everyone wants to have a spot. They don't want to co-locate necessarily. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll make this available to everyone after, and we'll send links also as well to everyone who's been on the call if you have your email address. I'm going to put in my email too for anyone, especially if you would like a talk on the issue. So if you want to reach me with questions related to Montgomery County specifically, or if you're interested in having more talks on this issue, I'm glad to always do that. And I'm so thankful to MoCo SafeG for inviting me for this talk, and look forward to what's next. Many hands make light work. Thank you so much.